Hi, I'm Sarah Stewart. I'm the minister at First Unitarian Church of Worcester, Massachusetts. We are a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Our mission is to honor the sacred, connect with each other, and serve justice. This is a presentation on spiritual aspects of end-of-life planning. I hope it's helpful to you as you think about planning memorial services for someone in your family or for your own future. Living, Dying, and Remembering, Spiritual Aspects of End-of-Life Planning. I'm going to begin with a reading by Persian poet Jalaluddin Rumi, The Grave is a Veil. On that fatal day when my casket rolls along, don't think my heart is in this world. Don't cry, don't wail in anguish, don't fall into a hole the demons have dug. That surely would be sad. When you see my procession, don't say I'm gone. It will be my reunion. As you lower me into the grave, don't say so long. The grave is a veil before the gathering of paradise. When you see that lowering down, think of rising. What harm is in the setting moon or sun? What seems a setting to you is a dawning. Though it may seem a prison, this vault releases the soul. Unless a seed enters the earth, it doesn't grow. Why are you doubting this human seed? Unless the bucket goes down, it won't come up full. Why should the Joseph of the Spirit resent the well? Close your mouth here and open it beyond, and in the nowhere air will be your song. That's a poem I have used at memorial services that I find beautiful. We are all always living and dying at the same time. At any moment, what we think of as living could become dying with a diagnosis or an accident or an injury, or occasionally in violence. Deanna Thompson is a theologian and a woman who has lived with a cancer diagnosis for many years. She wrote a wonderful book called Glimpsing Resurrection. And there's an image in that book where she says that all of us in our lives are flying through the air above a thick bank of clouds. And if something happens like a cancer diagnosis that makes us realize that we're mortal, it's as though the clouds suddenly part beneath us and we can see how far above the earth we're flying and how precarious our situation is. For many of us, those moments don't come until we've lived many decades on this earth. If we're very lucky, they come when we're ready for them. But it always helps us to think about how we want to handle the ends of our lives whenever that might come for us, and to think about how we want to help our family members in their time as well. So at different ages, we have different understandings of death and dying. Little children, younger than 7 years old, and these thoughts come from Dr. Samantha Saltz, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist. She says that children under 7 years old don't really have an understanding of death. They think of it as a reversible phenomenon. They think that it must have a cause. They think of it as temporary. They may not understand that a dead person won't be coming back. This can make it difficult if parents are grieving as well and trying to help a child in their grief, for the child's experience to be so different from the parents. But it's very natural for children at this age not to understand the finality of death. Children get a little bit older, up to about 11, between 7 and 11 years old, and they do begin to understand that death is final, that it's universal, that the loved one won't return, but they still think of death as having a cause. That person died because of something, not that death is something universal that will happen to all of us, and certainly not that death is something that will happen to them. Once children are teenagers over the age of 11, they have the ability to understand that death is an intrinsic part of life, that it happens to everybody, that it is, in Salz's words, a final, universal, and inevitable phenomenon. Of course, teenagers don't have fully developed frontal lobes of their brains, and so they may not connect their own risky behavior to the possibility of their death. They may not be able to imagine the fact that death will come to them, even if they understand it intellectually. And then we enter the phase where we spend most of our lives. This is my family here in this picture, which is adulthood, when we may bring children into the world or adopt children into our family. If you're a parent, you might know that terror that can come when you have a newborn, that suddenly this newborn is dependent on you for their very existence, and you can be beset with worries about what will happen to them when you're not with them all the time. And we also begin to care for our own aging parents and family members and become aware of their mortality and begin to help them with their healthcare needs and eventually with end-of-life planning. We also experience our own aging. Our bodies change, our abilities change. Something we used to be able to do, we can't do anymore. And sometimes we become able to do things either physically or spiritually, emotionally, that we weren't able to do when we were younger. So a question I have for you is, what are some of the benefits of aging that you have experienced? You can take a minute to think about this. Aging isn't all bad. It brings with it wisdom and opportunities that we didn't have when we were younger. So what are some of the benefits of aging that you have experienced? For all of us, however, there will come a point in our lives when we turn from actively living to actively dying. This is a photograph from the American Cancer Association. Some of us will die from illness, some from injury, some of us occasionally from violence, some just from frailty at the end of life, some from an accident. And our culture is changing how we think about death and dying. 100 years ago, death was something that happened at home. It was often an inevitable consequence of illness in an age before antibiotics, before many surgeries were possible. It was something that all families experienced as part of their normal family life, as part of their household life, having a body at home, caring for the dead body, and then going through the rituals of death and dying. As the 20th century progressed, death became something that happened in hospitals. Many illnesses became treatable. People would go to a hospital to treat an illness and often die in the hospital. But over the last 30 or so years, we have turned back toward thinking of death as a natural thing that must happen to all of us. With the advent of hospice care, people now have the opportunity to experience their own death with comfort measures as opposed to efforts to treat an illness or forestall dying. Death is a process more than it is an event, especially if it comes as a result of an illness or injury or frailty. Something happens to us and our bodies cannot recover from it. We may go through a process of slowly becoming less mobile, slowly eating less. We may enter hospice care and refuse curative treatment for something that's wrong with us. The moment of death comes when our bodies cease their functions, although for some of us, our brain function will cease first, and our families, following our wishes, will donate organ or tissue to other people who need them. Following the moment of our body's death, our families will have our bodies cremated or buried or donated to medical science. They may hold a funeral or memorial service for us. There may be a period of mourning, a Catholic wake, a Jewish period of sitting Shiva, And then for those closest to us, for those closest mourners, a longer period of mourning, lasting from a month to a year to sometimes even longer. Because many of us are likely to experience an illness or injury that leads to our death, there's a question for all of us to think about, which is, how do I want to live my life at the end of my life? When I am actively dying, how do I still want to live? I recommend this book to you, Being Mortal by Dr. Atul Gawande. It is an excellent meditation about the relationship between physicians and patients and thinking about the end of life. And throughout the book, Dr. Gawande talks about his own father's illness and death and dying, and how they made difficult decisions together as a family. And I want to read to you a little bit from this chapter, Chapter 7, Hard Conversations. Now, Atul Gawande's father is also a physician, and he was born in India and grew up there, but now he and his family live in the United States, and he practices medicine in Ohio. But he has begun to experience some neck pain and numbness in his left hand. He's gone to a doctor about it. He had an MRI, and he discovered after the MRI that he had a spinal cord tumor. So here's where I'm going to read to you. The Gawandes find 2 experts in this rare kind of tumor, one near the parents in Ohio and one near Atul Gawande in Boston, and they go to see both these neurosurgeons to get their opinions. Atul Gawande writes, "The neurosurgeon at my hospital advocated operating right away. The situation was dangerous, he told my father. He could become quadriplegic in weeks. No other options existed. Chemotherapy and radiation were not nearly as effective in stopping progression as surgery. The operation had risks, he said, but he wasn't too worried about them. He was more concerned about the tumor. My father needed to act before it was too late." The neurosurgeon at the Cleveland Clinic painted a more ambiguous picture. While he offered the same operation, he didn't push to do it right away. He said that while some spinal cord tumors advance rapidly, he'd seen many take years to progress, and they did so in stages, not all at once. He didn't think my father would go from a numb hand to total paralysis overnight. The question, therefore, was when to go in, and he believed that should be when the situation became intolerable enough for my father to want to attempt treatment. The surgeon was not as blithe about its risks as the other neurosurgeon. He thought it carried a 1 in 4 chance of itself causing quadriplegia or death. My father, he said, would, quote, need to draw a line in the sand, end quote. Were his symptoms already bad enough that he wanted surgery now? Would he want to wait until he started to feel hand symptoms that threatened his ability to do surgery? Would he want to wait until he couldn't walk? There will come a point for all of us, if we are facing a serious illness or injury in our elder years, when we have to ask ourselves questions like that. What really matters in life? So here's an exercise I have for you. Take a minute, pause this video, take a pen and paper, and list 5 activities, relationships, or experiences that make your life meaningful now. And begin each one with a verb. So don't write grandchildren, but write spending time with my grandchildren. So take a minute and do that, and then come back. So now I want you to imagine that you are considering some treatment like Dr. Gawande was considering. You are faced with some illness or injury, and you have to decide what kind of treatment to get to treat it, if any. Without treatment, you'll get sicker, but you don't know when, and the treatment itself carries significant risk. So looking at these lists, which of the things that make your life meaningful, which of the things on your list would inform your decision about treatment? Just take a minute and think about that. When we are seriously ill or injured or at the end of our lives, we may choose either palliative care and or hospice care. This comparison of hospice and palliative care comes from Vitas Healthcare. They're a hospice provider. Palliative care usually takes place in a hospital. It can coincide with curative intent. Um, it is intended to support the patient's comfort and well-being, and it's paid for by insurance or by the patient themselves. It's not covered by Medicare and Medicaid. Hospice care, which you may be more familiar with, is for patients who are at the end of their lives. It begins when two physicians certify that the patient has less than 6 months to live if the disease follows its usual course. Although patients sometimes thrive in hospice care away from the stresses of treatment and hospitalization. So I have known people who have spent more than 6 months on hospice. It's comfort care without curative intent. So there's no more effort to cure the patient of the disease that they are dying from. The intent is simply to keep them comfortable. It is covered by Medicare, Medicaid, and most private insurance. And it's delivered not necessarily in a hospital setting, but wherever the patient calls home. That could be at home, that could be in a nursing home, it could be at a dedicated hospice center. Occasionally it's in a hospital or a rehab facility. And it provides support for the family as well as the patient, spiritual and physical support for comfort and well-being at the end of life. Now, this is a personal decision about how people face the end of their lives. Sometimes people choose not to seek curative treatment for illness in order to focus on comfort and quality of life. And I want to tell you about a woman I'll call Monica, who I knew. Monica was in her early 70s when she received a diagnosis of stage 4 lung cancer. This came as a complete shock to her. She had not been a smoker for decades, not since she was a very young woman. And she lived in the woods of New Hampshire where the air was very clear, so she had no inkling that her lungs could be at risk. But here she was, younger than she wanted to be, diagnosed with lung cancer. And so at first she decided to pursue an aggressive form of treatment and have chemotherapy. The chemotherapy made her desperately ill, so sick that she couldn't enjoy spending time with anybody. It made her miserable. The symptoms of the chemotherapy were much worse than the symptoms of the cancer. And after one instance of chemotherapy treatment, she talked to her family and her physician again, and she decided to enter hospice care. She was staying with her sister, so hospice care came and sent her professionals, her hospice nurse and her chaplain, into her sister's home, helped get her a bed where she would be comfortable, helped keep her pain-free. And instead of living for perhaps 6 months, which she might have had with chemo, she only lived for about 5 weeks after that decision. But in those 5 weeks, she was able to enjoy time with her family, with her church friends. Her choir came and sang at her bedside. I was able to visit her as her minister. She was able to tend to those relationships. She and I planned her memorial service. She was conscious and present and loved her people in those last weeks, which she would not have been able to do if she had pursued the difficult treatment. But on the other hand, sometimes people do choose aggressive treatment because those additional weeks or months really matter to them. Ella was another woman who was diagnosed very young with an aggressive form of cancer. She was only in her early 40s, and she had 2 young boys. It really mattered to her to be able to live another 18 months in order to spend time with her children and to be their mom for that amount of time. It was worth it to her to go through the difficulties of chemotherapy and radiation so that her children should just get a little bit older before she died, and so that she could work with her family to make plans for their care following her passing. So this is a very personal decision. There is no one right answer. And even for you in your life, what's right at one point might not be right later on. It's something to talk about with your family and with your physician. And if you have an attorney, something you can do with them is to create a living will and a medical power of attorney. A living will helps set out some circumstances under which you would not want extreme life-saving measures to be taken, such as resuscitation. A medical power of attorney gives a trusted person the legal authority to make medical decisions for you if you can't. And those are both documents that you need to create with a lawyer. So for all of us, that moment comes when, however we have chosen to treat our illness or our injury, we have in fact died. And after the moment of death, your family will make decisions about the disposition of remains, or you will make decisions for a loved one. Many people these days choose cremation. Some people choose a burial. Another option is to donate your body to medical research, in which case it is used by a hospital or a medical school. And when they are done with the body, which could be several months later, they will return it to you cremated. In either case, you may choose to have a funeral or a memorial service. I'm, of course, very much in favor of families having these, and I'll talk about why a little bit later on in this presentation. A funeral is a ceremony, a service with the body present in a casket, and a memorial service is without the body present. So it's either in the form of ashes or you don't have the remains, perhaps because you've donated them. Otherwise, they are exactly the same. You might have a reception following the funeral or the memorial service, and then you may have a burial, an interment, or a scattering of ashes. If the body is present at the funeral, then the family usually goes directly from the church funeral at the church to the graveyard in order to do the burial. If you have an urn with ashes, the interment can happen directly following the memorial service, or it can be done later, or you can scatter the ashes at a place and time that's appropriate for your loved one. Here is just some details about planning a memorial service at church. My first advice to you is yes, please plan for a memorial service. Have a memorial service for your loved ones. Plan for one yourself. A memorial service is an important piece of the grieving process, and you might be worried that you don't want people to make a fuss over you, but you will be dead at the time of your memorial service. It's not about you anymore at that point. It is about your loved ones and what they need and how a memorial service helps them in their grieving. It doesn't have to be fancy, but I do recommend everybody have some kind of memorial service or funeral. You may have some favorite readings or hymns, perhaps a passage of scripture, a poem, a hymn that we sing in church. You can make note of these ahead of time for your family and for me. Don't pick too many. You're probably thinking about maybe 2 or 3 readings, maybe 1 or 2 hymns. You can think about a eulogy. The eulogy is the telling of the story of the person's life. I often do this as part of the service, and I sit with your family and hear their stories about your life and weave it together into one story. There may be a family member who can do this. Of course, I don't always know the person who's died as well as family or friends or sometimes a colleague does. Just keep in mind that it can be difficult emotionally to speak at a memorial service. If a family member is going to give a eulogy, I always recommend they have it written down so that if they're overcome in the moment, I can read it for them. And of course, we don't have to leave this in the hands of your family. You can meet with me before the end is nigh, even decades before, to tell me what you would like to have in your service. What are those readings or hymns? What prayers that you might be important to you. And you can tell me the story of your life. So then it doesn't have to all be filtered through your family. I have your words as well. And if you look in the comments on this video on YouTube, I'm going to put a link to a sample order of service for a memorial service in our church, so you can look at that. There are other people in the church are part of this planning. Our Director of Operations, Jennifer Bowes, she will help you make the arrangements for the building. She can tell you caterers we work with for receptions, florists we work with for flowers, the practicalities of how you want the building set up. We make sure that a skilled musician is available, either our director of music or someone they recommend, to play either our organ or our piano or both. If you're a member of the church, there's no charge for my services or for the building itself. We do have charges for non-members. But for everybody, there's a fee for the musician and the sexton. So something that you might think about is, as you're wanting to pre-plan your own memorial service or planning a family member's, is what has been most meaningful about a memorial service that you have attended? Just take a minute and think about that. That may help you know what you would want in your own service. I want to come back for a minute to the question of why I think it's so important to have a memorial service. In my experience, death is not exactly a single event, but rather the opening of a door into a corridor. And in my experience, at the other end of that corridor is the memorial service. And while you're in that corridor in between death and the memorial service, you may feel as though your loved one's spirit is still with you. You are still shepherding them on their way. You are making decisions about the disposition of their remains. You are planning the service. You're contacting family. You are really helping your loved one be on their journey. And the memorial service, which is a moment when grief becomes public and is witnessed by your community, it's at the other end of that corridor, and the door opens for both of you. It gives your loved one's spirit permission to be on its journey, and it gives you permission to begin the journey of grieving. Sometimes I think families don't want the memorial service because they're afraid of that journey of grieving, but you know what? It's inevitable. If someone you love dies, there is no escape from the feeling of grief. A memorial service helps to honor that truth and that reality and gives you permission to enter that difficult but necessary step of grieving. If you have any questions about any of this, or if you would like to schedule a time to talk with me as your minister about a future memorial service for yourself, you can email me, minister@firstunitarian.com. And I'm going to leave you with this quote from Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson. "We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. We see the world piece by piece as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole of which these are shining parts is the soul." Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon.